What would you do if you came home one day and found every tree in your yard destroyed, without warning, without permission? And what if the person responsible was the HOA president, smiling smugly, telling you it was for community aesthetics? Most people would be furious. But what happens when the homeowner is a federal judge? This HOA had no idea who they were messing with. Watch until the end to see how justice was served. Comment your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories. Malcolm Hayes had always been a man of patience. It came with the job. As a federal judge, he had seen people lose their composure in the courtroom, throwing tantrums when the law didn't bend in their favor. He had spent years perfecting the art of controlled fury, the kind that settled in his bones but never showed on his face. But this was different. It was a crisp autumn evening when Malcolm turned onto his street, the golden hues of the setting sun filtering through the trees, or at least where they used to be. As he pulled into his driveway, something felt off. At first, he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Then his heart dropped. Every single tree in his yard was gone. Not trimmed, not pruned, completely destroyed. Stumps jutted out of the earth like gravestones, sawdust littered the grass, and the once vibrant canopy that had shaded his home for decades had vanished. A massacre. Malcolm sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced. Had there been a storm, a freak accident, a misunderstanding with the city? No, none of that made sense, and then he saw it. A HOA-branded pickup truck sat smugly in his driveway, as if it belonged there. And stepping out of the passenger seat, wearing her usual expression of self-importance, was Veronica Lancaster. She was the kind of woman who had probably never been told no in her life. Mid-50s, pressed white blazer, short blonde bob styled to perfection, and a perpetual smirk that could make a saint snap. She always carried herself like she was the queen of the neighborhood, and to some extent she was. But not here. Not on Malcolm's property. He pushed the car door open, stepping out slowly, deliberately. Veronica folded her arms, that smug grin plastered on her face. "Oh, Malcolm, you're home," she chirped, as if they were long-lost friends. Malcolm didn't respond. He was still processing the destruction around him, his gaze sweeping over the barren wasteland that had once been his sanctuary. His trees had stood for over 50 years. Some of them had been planted by his grandfather when he first bought the land, long before the HOA even existed. What the hell happened here? Malcolm's voice was dangerously calm. Veronica let out a small, condescending laugh as if he were overreacting. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a hand. "We were just improving the community's aesthetics. Your trees, well, they didn't exactly fit the neighborhood's look, you know. We have a standard to uphold." Malcolm stared at her. Aesthetic standards. That was her excuse for committing what was essentially property destruction. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. This was not the place to explode. He had seen men ruin their own cases by letting emotions take control. This was a chess game now, and Veronica had just made a fatal move. "Let me get this straight," Malcolm said, his voice measured. "You came onto my property without my permission and destroyed trees that have been here for half a century." Veronica blinked, momentarily thrown off by his lack of immediate outrage. She had expected yelling, arguing, maybe even a threat. Instead, he was giving her nothing. She quickly recovered, tilting her chin up. "The HOA has the right to maintain the visual harmony of the neighborhood," she declared. Malcolm let out a short, humorless chuckle. "That's interesting." He took a step closer, towering over her, "because I never signed a single document agreeing to be part of the HOA." For the first time, Veronica's confidence faltered, Just a flicker, but Malcolm saw it. Well, she stammered. The HOA's rules still apply to all properties within the subdivision. No, they don't, Malcolm interrupted, his tone sharp now. And you know that. He watched her swallow, but she quickly masked it with another arrogant smirk. Malcolm, really, there's no need to make this a legal issue. We were simply trying to help. The trees were old anyway. You should be thanking us for. You trespassed. You destroyed private property, and you think I should be thanking you. Malcolm's voice dropped, quiet but lethal. Veronica took a small step back. She wasn't intimidated, at least not yet, but she was realizing that maybe, just maybe, she had picked the wrong fight. Malcolm turned away from her, surveying the damage once more. It was more than just trees, it was history. His family had grown up with those trees. They had provided shade on sweltering Georgia summers, leaves crunching underfoot in the fall. His mother used to sit on the porch, sipping sweet tea beneath their branches. And now all of that was gone, because of some HOA dictator who thought she was above the law. Malcolm flexed his fingers, letting the rage settle into something colder, something useful. Finally, he turned back to Veronica, his expression unreadable. This isn't over. For the first time, her smirk disappeared. Malcolm didn't wait for a response. He walked past her, heading straight for his front door. He had work to do. The HOA thought they could bully him into compliance. They thought they could walk onto his land and destroy what was his just because they didn't like the way it looked. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And by the time he was finished with them, they would never forget it. Malcolm didn't react the way Veronica expected. She had anticipated outrage, shouting, maybe even threats of legal action. But instead, the tall, imposing judge simply stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Veronica's smug confidence faltered for just a moment. Then Malcolm spoke. "What authority does the HOA have to destroy my property?" His voice was calm, too calm. Veronica, regaining her composure, crossed her arms and gave him a patronizing smile. "Malcolm, please. The HOA exists to maintain the quality and uniformity of this community. Your trees, while I'm sure they were lovely in their own way, didn't align with the standards we have in place. It was nothing personal, just a necessary action to ensure the neighborhood remains aesthetically pleasing." Malcolm didn't blink. "That's not what I asked. What legal authority does the HOA have over my property?" There was an edge to his tone now, and Veronica noticed. She huffed, rolling her eyes. "The HOA has jurisdiction over all properties in this subdivision. It's written in our bylaws, which apply to everyone who lives here." "Interesting," Malcolm murmured. "Because I never signed any HOA agreement, never opted into your bylaws, so tell me, Veronica, how exactly do they apply to me?" Veronica opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, real uncertainty flickered across her face. Malcolm took a slow step forward. "Did you even check before you ordered my trees to be cut down?" His tone was sharp, precise, like a scalpel. "Or did you assume, like you always do, that no one would challenge you?" Veronica stiffened. I was under the impression that all properties in this area fell under HOA governance." "Then you were wrong." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Malcolm could see it now, the dawning realization in Veronica's eyes. She had messed up. Badly. And for the first time she knew it. Malcolm took out his phone. "I think we're done here, but don't worry, you'll be hearing from me soon." He didn't wait for a response. He walked straight into his house, shutting the door behind him. Veronica Lancaster had just made the worst mistake of her life, and now he was going to bury her with it. Malcolm sat at his desk, exhaling slowly. He wanted to rage. He wanted to slam his fist against the table and demand justice. But that wasn't how he operated. Justice wasn't about emotions. It was about precision. So he started with the most basic thing, proof. He pulled up the security camera footage from his house. There it was. Time-stamped video of HOA workers trespassing onto his land, unloading their equipment and methodically butchering his trees. One by one, he watched as they felled each towering oak, branches crashing to the ground like fallen soldiers. The footage showed them laughing, joking, completely unconcerned about the damage they were causing. Malcolm felt a slow burn in his chest. They thought they could get away with this. He clipped the footage, saved it to multiple devices, and backed it up to the cloud. Then he pulled up his property records. And there it was in black and white. His property was not legally under HOA jurisdiction. No agreement, no contract, no authority. The HOA had zero legal standing to enforce any of their rules on him. He sat back, fingers steepled, his mind racing. Trespassing. Property destruction. Unauthorized land modification. Oh, this was going to be beautiful. But he wasn't done yet. Because Malcolm knew people like Veronica, entitled, power-hungry, and people like that. They never just overreach in one area. So he dug deeper. Most homeowners never actually read their HOA's financial reports. They got the yearly statement, saw the numbers, grumbled about dues, and moved on. Malcolm wasn't most homeowners. As a judge, he had a trained eye for corruption. He knew what to look for, and within 30 minutes of combing through the HOA's publicly available records, he found it. Massive fraud. Tens of thousands of dollars in landscaping fees paid to companies that didn't exist. Suspicious wire transfers to accounts that had no listed owners. Absurd expenditures that had nothing to do with the neighborhood, like a $12,000 administrative fee paid directly to Veronica Lancaster. Malcolm let out a slow whistle. This wasn't just incompetence. This was criminal. He started saving everything, documenting every transaction, cross-referencing dates. He built a case file, the kind that could make even the most confident lawyer sweat. Veronica wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a fraud. And Malcolm wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was about to bring the entire HOA down. By the time Malcolm was done compiling his evidence, it was well past midnight. His desk was covered in papers, legal codes, printed statements. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow he would make the first move. But for now, he let himself enjoy the silence. Because soon enough, Veronica Lancaster was going to realize something very, very important. She had picked a fight with the wrong man. The morning after Malcolm had compiled his evidence, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Excitement. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even just about justice for himself. This was about exposing a system of corruption that had gone unchecked for too long, and he knew exactly how to dismantle it. The first thing Malcolm did was call the city's environmental office. Yes, I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding the unlawful destruction of protected trees on private property. The woman on the other end of the line perked up immediately. Sir, can you clarify? You're saying someone removed trees from your property without authorization. That's exactly what I'm saying. Malcolm then gave her the full breakdown, the security footage showing the HOA's workers trespassing, the lack of permits, because he had already checked and there had been none issued for tree removal, the local law that made it illegal to remove mature trees without a permit, punishable by tens of thousands of dollars in fines. By the time he was done explaining, the woman was furious. This is a serious violation, she said. We'll send out an investigator immediately. And just like that, the city was involved. HOA had officially stepped into a legal minefield. Next up, Malcolm sent his findings to the state's auditing department. Now, A government audit isn't something you can just brush off. It's not like a neighbor complaining about a parking violation. No, when the audit department gets a financial complaint, especially one with clear evidence of fraud, they don't take their time. They dig. And Malcolm had handed them a shovel. He attached everything, the suspicious transactions in the HOA's records, the payments to non-existent companies, the direct payments to Veronica Lancaster's personal account. Less than an hour after submitting the complaint, he got a response. "Mr. Hayes, we've reviewed the documents you sent, and this case meets the criteria for financial misconduct investigation. A formal inquiry is now open." Malcolm smirked. That meant subpoenas. That meant bank records pulled. That meant the HOA's accounts were about to be scrutinized by professionals who knew how to find every missing penny. Veronica had no idea that her empire was already crumbling. Now came the fun part. Malcolm knew that even with the city investigating the illegal tree removal and the state investigating the financial fraud, the HOA would still try to cover things up. So he cut off their escape route. That afternoon, Malcolm reached out to his neighbors. Now, here's the thing about HOAs. Most people hate them but feel powerless to fight back. Not anymore. Malcolm printed out key pieces of evidence, the fake transactions, the proof of unauthorized spending, the illegal fines, and invited a small group of homeowners over for a friendly conversation. Within 20 minutes, outrage had spread through the room like wildfire. "They've been stealing from us this whole time. So that's why our dues keep going up every year. We need to do something about this." Malcolm leaned back, satisfied. "Don't worry. We will." By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Word spread fast. The same people who had once been too afraid to challenge Veronica and the HOA were now furious. People started demanding answers. Veronica tried damage control, but it was too late. Neighbors began bombarding the HOA office with calls. People stopped paying their dues, demanding to know where their money was going. And then, the final blow landed. The HOA received a formal notice from the city. They were under investigation for unauthorized tree removal. They were facing potential fines up to $50,000. At the same time, the state auditors arrived at their office, demanding access to their financial records. Veronica was trapped, and she knew it. So, in a desperate move, she did the only thing she could think of. She called an emergency HOA meeting. Malcolm wasn't surprised. When people like Veronica feel cornered, they don't take responsibility. They don't admit wrongdoing. They try to control the narrative. So when he got the HOA meeting notice, he smirked. This was it, the perfect opportunity to deliver the final blow. The meeting was set for that Saturday evening in the neighborhood's community center. Malcolm could already picture how it would go. Veronica would try to downplay the situation. She'd use buzzwords like miscommunication and administrative oversight. She tried to manipulate the crowd into believing that everything was fine. But what she didn't know, Malcolm had every piece of evidence ready, the proof of illegal activity, the reports from the city and the state, the financial documents showing she had stolen money from the community, and he wasn't just going to show them. He was going to publicly expose her, in front of every single person in the neighborhood. The moment Veronica called that meeting, she didn't realize she had just scheduled her own downfall. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Checkmate. The community center was packed that evening. Malcolm had expected a decent turnout, but this was a full-blown revolt. Residents filled the rows of folding chairs, whispering among themselves, their faces set in frustration, suspicion, and in some cases, outright rage. Word had spread fast about the illegal tree removal, about the financial irregularities, about the fact that the HOA had been caught red-handed. And at the center of it all sat Veronica Lancaster. She had positioned herself at the front, seated behind a long, folding table flanked by two HOA board members. But even from across the room, Malcolm could see the tension in her posture, the stiffness in her shoulders, the slight clench of her jaw. She knew she was losing control. She cleared her throat and stood, forcing a smile. "Good evening, everyone. I called this meeting to address some unfortunate misunderstandings that have been circulating in the neighborhood." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Misunderstandings. That's what she was calling it. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching. Veronica continued, her voice carrying that same condescending tone she always used when she thought she was the smartest person in the room. "There have been some concerns about recent decisions made by the HOA, including the landscaping adjustments on Mr. Hayes' property. While I understand the emotions involved, I want to clarify that all actions taken were done with the best interests of the community in mind." Someone near the front scoffed. A man in a button-up shirt stood. "Landscaping adjustments. You destroyed his trees without permission." A woman next to him added, "And what about the money? Why do our HOA dues keep increasing but nothing ever gets fixed?" The murmurs grew louder. Veronica held up a hand, trying to maintain control. Now, I understand that things may not have been communicated as clearly as they should have been, and for that I take full responsibility. But I assure you there is no wrongdoing here." That was it. Malcolm stood, and just like that the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him as he calmly stepped forward, holding a thick manila folder. He placed it on the table in front of Veronica. "You want to talk about HOA finances? Fine, let's talk about them." A hush settled over the room. Veronica's smile wavered. "Malcolm, He flipped the folder open, and the truth spilled out. Malcolm's voice was calm, controlled, but lethal. "These are official HOA financial records, documents that, until recently, were conveniently difficult for homeowners to access. But I found them, and they paint an interesting picture." He lifted a page filled with transaction logs. "Here's a $12,000 administrative fee paid last year to a consulting company that doesn't exist. And here's another $8,500 for community maintenance that never actually happened." The crowd muttered in disbelief. A man in the back shouted, "Where the hell is our money going?" Malcolm wasn't finished. He turned the page. "And here we have direct transfers, thousands of dollars moved into a personal bank account. Now, I found that strange, so I did some digging. Guess whose name is on that account?" He looked directly at Veronica. The color drained from her face. The room erupted. "Are you kidding me? You've been stealing from us. I want my damn money back." Veronica held up her hands, her expression wavering between panic and forced composure. I can explain," she stammered. "These were administrative expenses. I was reimbursing costs associated with HOA operations." "Reimbursing yourself," Malcolm shot back, "with thousands of dollars in unapproved transactions. And let's not forget, while you were pocketing money, the neighborhood was falling apart, potholes unfixed, streetlights out for months. Meanwhile, you've been funneling funds into your own account." Someone stood up and yelled, "She needs to be removed from the HOA. She needs to be investigated," another added. Malcolm nodded. "That part's already taken care of." He pulled out one last document, a formal notice from the city. "This is an official report from the Environmental Office. The HOA illegally removed protected trees from my property, and as a result, they're facing fines upwards of $50,000. The crowd exploded again. Veronica staggered back, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her world was collapsing in real time, but the final blow hadn't landed yet. Then her phone rang. The room fell silent as Veronica stared at the screen. Malcolm could see it, the barely concealed panic behind her eyes. With shaking hands, she answered. "Hello," she listened. And then her face turned ghostly white. The entire room watched as the realization sank in. She stammered, "There must be some mistake, yes, I understand." But her voice faded into silence. When she finally lowered the phone, she didn't look at anyone. Malcolm spoke for her. "That was the state auditing department, wasn't it?" Veronica didn't respond. Malcolm turned to the crowd. "As of now, the government has officially opened a fraud investigation into the HOA. Their accounts have been frozen. All financial activities are under review, and I have no doubt that criminal charges will be filed soon." The crowd erupted one last time, and Veronica, she ran. She shoved past chairs, bolted for the exit, her heels clicking against the tile floor. No one stopped her, because everyone in that room knew she was already finished. By the next morning, the news had spread. Veronica resigned from the HOA, but it didn't matter. Her home went up for sale that same week. She left quietly, moving across the country in an attempt to escape public humiliation. And the HOA dissolved. The residents, finally free from Veronica's reign of corruption, elected a new board, one that would actually serve the community instead of robbing it. As for Malcolm, he sat on his porch looking over the empty space where his trees once stood, and for the first time since this all began, he smiled. Because the trees, they would grow back, but Veronica's power, that was gone forever. The morning after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer, almost as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. For years, the residents had lived under the iron grip of the HOA, walking on eggshells, afraid of sudden fines, random rule changes, and power-hungry board members who thrived on control. But now that era was over. The HOA had been exposed, dismantled, and disgraced. And at the center of it all stood Malcolm Hayes, the man who had never backed down, never been intimidated, and had delivered justice in the most poetic way possible. It had taken calm, intelligence, and the power of the law, the very thing Veronica had tried to twist in her favor. She had thought she was untouchable. She had thought she could bend the rules and get away with it. But Malcolm had done what no one else dared to. He had fought back, and he had won. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and brutal. By the next morning, Veronica Lancaster was in full panic mode. Her once unshakable reputation had crumbled overnight. For years, she had walked around with an air of superiority, acting as though she was the ruler of the neighborhood. But now she was nothing more than a disgraced fraud, her name spoken in hushed tones, not with admiration but with resentment and disgust. Within 24 hours, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. It was a desperate attempt to escape the consequences. She didn't try to defend herself. She didn't plead for understanding. She just wanted out. And that's when it hit Malcolm. Veronica had never actually cared about the neighborhood. She had used the HOA for power, control, and personal gain, but now that she could no longer wield authority over others, she had no reason to stay. She wasn't part of this community. She had only ever ruled over it. And now, stripped of her power, she was running. A week later, the moving trucks arrived. Neighbors gathered in small groups, watching in silence as her furniture, expensive decor, and personal belongings were loaded into the vehicles. No one said a word to her. There were no farewell waves, no sympathetic goodbyes. Just watchful eyes and quiet judgment. And Veronica, she avoided making eye contact. For years, she had marched through the neighborhood like she owned it, issuing citations, belittling homeowners, acting as if she were above them all. But today, she kept her head down. She hurried into her car, her face flushed with humiliation, and within minutes she was gone. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a disgraced exit for a woman who had spent years making everyone else's lives miserable. With Veronica out of the picture, the HOA collapsed almost immediately. The remaining board members, the same people who had once backed her blindly, resigned within days. not because they wanted to do the right thing, but because they didn't want to go down with her. Then came the official ruling from the state audit department. Malcolm had been right all along. Thousands of dollars had been stolen. Bogus fees had been charged to homeowners. Funds had been funneled into Veronica's personal accounts. It was fraud, plain and simple. And once the financial misconduct was officially confirmed, the government froze all HOA assets. With no money, no leadership, and no way to function, the HOA had no choice. It was dissolved. Years of bullying, corruption, and unchecked power gone in an instant, and the best part, no one mourned it. For the first time in a decade, the residents had control over their own neighborhood again. With the HOA dead, they came together to rebuild. But this time, it was different. No more unjustified fines. No more random rule changes. No more corrupt board members. Instead, they formed a new community group, one where homeowners actually had a say in what happened. They made decisions together. They worked with each other, not against each other. And slowly but surely, the neighborhood transformed into what it was always meant to be, a place where people actually wanted to live. One evening, Malcolm sat on his porch, a hot cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His yard was still bare. The trees that had once stood tall and strong were gone, their absence a reminder of how this all began. But Malcolm didn't feel anger anymore, because this wasn't just about trees. This was about justice. His trees had been illegally destroyed. His rights had been violated. But instead of reacting with rage, instead of stooping to their level, he had done what he did best. He used the law. Veronica had believed herself untouchable. She had thought her power was absolute. But in the end, she had been brought down by the very rules she had tried to manipulate. She had been exposed, humiliated, and erased from the community she once controlled. Malcolm took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind at peace. The trees, they would grow back. It would take time, but New Life, the story of Malcolm Hayes and the downfall of the HOA, is a powerful reminder that no one is above the law, and those who abuse power will eventually face the consequences. Veronica Lancaster believed she was untouchable, using her authority to manipulate, control, and enrich herself at the expense of others. But power is never absolute. The moment someone like Malcolm, armed with knowledge and determination, stood up to her, her empire crumbled. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. Malcolm didn't need to shout, threaten, or resort to the same tactics as his oppressors. He simply used the law, the very system Veronica had tried to exploit, to take her down. This story also highlights how people will tolerate oppression until they won't. For years, the homeowners in the neighborhood felt powerless, believing they had no choice but to accept the HOA's tyranny. But once they realized they weren't alone, they came together and reclaimed their community. Legacies last longer than authority. Veronica's reign ended the moment she lost power, but Malcolm's actions created a lasting impact. His trees were gone, but in their place, something far greater had grown: justice, unity, and freedom. Most importantly, this story teaches us that the law is a weapon for those who know how to wield it. Many people feel helpless against corruption, but Malcolm proved that knowledge and persistence can dismantle even the most oppressive systems. Change happens when people refuse to accept mistreatment any longer, and in the end, justice always finds a way.